So the ADSR method can be a way for artists to think about their work, both in a critique as well as when we return to the studio. So it's a generative method as well. I produced a 12-page broadsheet. A broadsheet is basically, you can think of it as a newspaper. The ADSR critique method is a method of understanding works of art and design, and it's based upon a metaphor. The metaphor is that of attack, decay, sustain, and release. So if you've ever done any music synthesis, it's one of the primary models by which people synthesize music. There are 4 knobs on a synthesizer that allows you to address these different components of the envelope. And that's the primary metaphor that we use here. Okay, so there is very little agreement among artists as to what actually constitutes critique. Unfortunately, the process of critique in art and design schools is misunderstood and has come to mean many things, most of which are not critique. Many things that are pretending to be critique, I would suggest are in fact not critique. We can debate whether or not there is any validity to them. We can see over here on the right-hand side of this diagram, which we'll get to in a second, what critique is and what critique is not. And there are a set of activities or behaviors, including prescription, untrained psychoanalysis, citation, and thesis defense, that I would suggest in art and design schools are masquerading as critique, but they're not. So the ADSR critique method was developed over a 24-year period by me as head of the Graduate 2D department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. So in this diagram, for the sake of brevity, I'll be using the term art object to refer to that thing being critiqued. This term, in most instances, can be thought of as any piece of design, sculpture, painting, installation, poem, photography, or performance. When specific clarification is necessary to make a point, I'll use the specific term design or performance. For the sake of clarity and brevity, I'll be using the term art object to refer to the broad category that includes those things, right? And then I'm also going to be using, the term artist. So in this diagram, the term artist will be used as an umbrella term in place of the more specific terms designer, graphic designer, poet, sculptor. When there's a discipline-specific exception to be made, I'll use a more specific term. And as we discussed previously, in this video, ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. It's a model used to describe how the sound of a musical note changes over time in synthesizers and electronic music. The attack is how quickly the sound reaches its maximum level after a note is played. Decay is how the sound diminishes to the sustain level. Sustain is the level during the main part of the note, and release is how the sound fades when the note ends. And this diagram here is really how we will discuss, or how the primary metaphor that we will use to try to understand a work of art. Now, the point on the left, this point right here, is the first 1/100,000th of a second in the presence of the work of art. And the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is time. So here's the first 1/100,000th of a second in the presence of the work of art, and this is this moment actually here where release happens. This moment right here is when we are no longer in the physical presence of that work. And this is time going off into infinity, and we'll get into that in a second. So when we look at the attack phase, as I just mentioned, it's the impression of the work in the first 1/100,000th of a second in the presence of the work. The initial non-intellectual impression of the work. The attack phase, Charles Sanders Peirce's firstness, the attack phase ends when cognition begins. Once the viewer attempts to make sense of the work of the attack phase has ended. So the easiest way to describe this is that imagine walking into a museum, or imagine walking into a critique room. There is a moment where our perceptual field turns to take in a work of art. It's important in the attack phase to make note of our immediate, formal, primarily phenomenological and experiential reaction to that work. Does the work have a presence to it? How do we feel about that work? We mark that and make note of that in the attack phase. So when we look at it here, as I'll get into in a moment, all works of art have different characters to their attack phase. Some are very quick, in other words, moving very quickly up this vertical axis, and some are very slow. That is an important component of understanding a work of art. The decay phase marks the moment an object is subjected to a cognitive load, to thinking. Decay follows attack and is the second phase of the encounter with the design art object. So decay marks the moment we begin intellectualizing the art object. Decay is when we attempt to make sense of the art experience. And during decay, we track and take note of the content, character, and quality of our thinking is engendered by the art experience object. So why is this important? It is important because works of art are ideas made manifest in material. Works of art must be able to endure and, more importantly, reward a sustained cognitive load. That's in the sustained phase. But so what ends up happening is we move from that initial moment where the work of art makes itself available to us intellectually, phenomenologically, to the moment where we subject the work to a cognitive load. Now, the question becomes, what happens in that moment? And again, we're marking that. You can see here in these different diagrams that I have that this line is where we mark the decay phase. We start thinking about, what does this work mean? Some work initially falls off. Other work, we find that the work has a kind of power to it, where we feel stimulated and alive and enlivened by our thinking initially. Okay, but that's again, the decay phase is where when the work, the best description of it is right here. Decay is how the perception of the work diminishes to the sustain level. Now, sustain is the ability of a work of art to sustain and reward cognition. Successful work must be able to reward a sustained cognitive load. Sustain is the capacity for a work of art to hold attention through its form, phenomenon, concept, context, or any combination of these elements. In the sustained phase of the work, we pay attention and mark the character of our response to the work over time, while still in the presence of the work. So, as an example, in critique, if we look at these different diagrams that I've produced showing 4 different works of art, if we look at the sustained phase, this is a rough schematic to show, if we pay attention in critique, not necessarily, so again, these are the 4 diagrams that showing 4 different works of art. If we look at the sustained phase, we're seeing different profiles. So oftentimes in critique, what will happen is, if we pay attention not to what is actually being said, this work is good, this work is bad, but we pay attention to the character of the conversation, and we can kind of trace an outline. And my thesis is that the capacity for the work of art to engender, fecund, a rich conversation as we are discussing the work or thinking through the work is arguably the second most important way of understanding whether a work of what the content, what the character of the work is. So here we can see fast attack versus slow attack work. So in that first 1/100,000th of a second, some work has an extremely strong presence to it. Some work has a very slow attack where you look at the work and you think, I don't really know how to make sense of this phenomenologically, but then it grows on you. And then when we get into the release phase, which is arguably the most important component of work, it's the effect of the work in the mind and memory once no longer in the presence of the work. So if we look at this diagram, the 4th line vertical line, marks the moment where we are no longer in the presence of the work. Okay? The time taken from the sustained time until the amplitude is again at 0. The release phase marks the difference between good work and important work. Okay? So important work is fecund and lingers in the mind and memory once out of the presence of the work. So fecundity. What is fecundity? Fecund is is an adjective, producing or capable of producing an abundance of offspring or new growth. Fertile, a lush and fecund garden. Her fecund imagination. Technical, of a woman or woman capable of becoming pregnant and giving birth. Origin late Middle English, from French fecund or Latin fecundus. So ultimately, you can judge a tree by its fruit. Matthew 7:16, you will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Matthew 7:20, therefore by their fruits you shall know them. So the primary activity of critique is to call a work into crisis. And critique is not to be won. One way we attempt to understand both the quality of the work as well as the quality of the critique is to focus on the character of the conversation during critique. Did the work engender a fecund conversation? Was the work the catalyst for this conversation? Or was the conversation and critique simply the result of the participants' idiosyncrasies? And then how do we judge these issues? What we do is we use the principle of correspondence. So all comments all comments about a work, all thinking about a work, can be cut into two different spheres. And we can use the principle of correspondence to try to judge the quality of what's being said about a work. And that principle assesses how closely statements about the work correspond to the actual work. Can statements about the work be verified within the work itself? So what we do is we point all criticism back to that which is available in the work itself. Comments can be judged based upon to what degree do the comments show correspondence in the work. Now, later in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show examples of this from Christopher Kaufman, who recently presented this piece, Competition Will Destroy You Until You Visit the Graves. And I'm going to break down a schematic, very brief schematic diagram of how I think this work functions. But I think another important component of this picture is to understand what critique is and what critique is not, because I think that I'm going to make the case that a lot of the activities that take place within art and design schools, they're not in fact critique. Now, we can argue about whether or not they have any validity, any merit, but I'm going to suggest that they're not in fact critique. So what critique is? The fundamental function of critique is to call a work into crisis. And how do I know that? Because of the etymological root of the word critique. Now, words have power. Words mean things. They don't mean other things. So when we look at this, critique, critical examination or review of the merits of something, 1702, a restored French spelling of 17th. Ultimately, the point here is art of criticism. Ultimately, from the Greek kritike, techne, the critical art is a verb to write or deliver a critique. If we come down here and look at the blue, it's from the Greek kritikos, able to make judgments, from krinein, to separate, to decide, from pi root, K-R-E-I, to sieve, thus discriminate or distinguish. Now that word, that Greek root is shared with crisis, early 15th century, decisive point in the progression of a disease, also vitally important or decisive state of things, from the same thing, krinein, to separate, decide, judge, from pi root, K-R-E-I, to sieve, thus discriminate or distinguish. They have a shared etymological root. Crisis and critique have a shared etymological root, thus establishing that the fundamental function of critique is to call a work into crisis. And I would go on to suggest that why is that important? Well, it's important because really what ends up happening is we end up seeing that what it does is it forms a kind of Hegelian dialectic. The process of critique, when productive, can be thought of as a form of the Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic, Noun, philosophy, an interpretive method in which the contradiction between a proposition, a thesis, remember from our previous conversation, the art object, and its antithesis, its criticism, is resolved, the studio work, at a higher level of truth. So we can see this, that the thesis, again, is the art object equals the thesis. The critique of the art object, and I'm not talking about a formal academic critique. I'm talking about the critique. Calling a work into crisis can happen in this studio. It can happen in your own studio. It can happen among peers, among friends. It can happen in an academic environment. It can happen in graduate school. It can happen in undergraduate school. But the point is that antithesis, the antithesis, is the critique of the object. Now, the critique process exposes problems in the work, right? Now, the artist returns to the studio, which is right here. The work of the studio is that the artist struggles to solve the problem. Now, the resolution of the problem is synthesis. So the cycle repeats itself. So everything in this blue box is the work of the studio. Now, this is an important component that I go over and over again, which is that, to my mind, the most generous, the most charitable thing that we can do for one another as human beings, but also as artists and designers, is in fact to provide critical thinking, to call the work into crisis, to take a look at what's happening in the critique and to provide fecund, rich problems, a rich set of problems for the artist, designer, writer, musician, or poet to work on. Now, I'm going to go over what critique is not and what I see in academic environments masquerading as critique. All right, so these are what I see, what critique is not. And I would say that there are numerous commonplace practices in schools and among artists that masquerade as critique. Now, while these practices possess varying degrees of merit, they are not critique, okay? And what are they? So one of the biggest no-nos and one of the most important thing, or one of the, sorry about this. Oops. One of the things that I see over and over is prescription or prescriptive critique, often found in educational settings as akin to a doctor prescribing medicine. So when a critic speculates on a work should be, they engage in a hypothetical exercise that breaches the principle of correspondence. Prescription conjures a matrix of infinite possibilities, constructing imaginary works in the minds of critics and artists that differ fundamentally from the existing work. For example, the statement, "Make that red," presents an infinite array of possible reds, diverging from the idea of a perfect solution. Prescription is the primary method that I would suggest that we find in undergraduate schools and in bad grad programs, which is, and quite frankly, I think among not good teachers. And it is to make suggestions on works that are not available in the room. And why is that a problem? So whenever I say, if you made the work, if you did the following things to the work, there are a number of problems. The first is that all works of art and all ideas, to a degree, exist in the realm of perfection in the mind of the person who is articulating that position. Of course, if you just did the following, you would solve the problem of the piece, but that's not actually what happens. Anything that's made manifest, any ideas that are made manifest in material are, the moment that you attempt to make something, there is an absolute explosion of potential choices in the making. Which red? This red, that red. Not just that, but the fact that work, that as we make work, as ideas are made manifest in materials, they slide away from perfection. Anyone who's ever worked in a wood shop understands this, right? And so the problem with prescription is that not only when I try to communicate to you that if you did the following, it would solve the problem, not only is that there are two different mental images at play between the artist and the critic, but the fact that the object is not in front of us. So prescription is the most common form of problematic critique that we find, but we'll also probably in graduate schools, we find untrained psychoanalysis. And critique should not focus on the artist's personal trauma, but on the work itself. Shifting the conversation to the artist's psyche conflates the object with the individual. Now, there is a lot of debate. There's a lot of debate over this in critical theory about what's referred to as reception theory, but untrained psychoanalysis should not focus on the artist's personal trauma, but on the artwork itself. Untrained psychoanalysis, talking about changing the focus, taking the focus off of the principle of correspondence, off of the object itself. I see this in the work, and the ramifications are thus. To turning the focus, in fact, to the individual and to say, talk to me about your trauma, talk to me about, those things might have therapeutic value, but they are no longer about the work of art primarily. There are a number of reasons for this, but primarily that the artist doesn't control the meaning of the work. Works of art are situated culturally. They exist. They are objects that reside within a cultural matrix, and therefore the meaning of them is constructed socially. The artist themselves does not control the meaning of the work. So untrained psychoanalysis is a huge problem. Something that has happened in the last, probably in my experience, in the last 10 years, is that critique becomes a form of emotional support. Praise, such as "you've done great," is counterproductive. Growth stems from grappling with problems within the work, as suggested by the Hegelian dialectic. So one of the kind of cultural trends that I've seen over and over is this move towards that any form of critical thinking about work is seen as a threat by the person who presents the work. And this is one of the most quizzical, one of the most confusing components of contemporary culture, the academic environment and our current ethos, something that confuses me deeply. That if I am told repeatedly that I'm a genius and that the work that I'm doing has no problems, there is little capacity for me to grow as an artist. There are no rich problems for me to work with. I have a colleague who will remain nameless, who at a different institution mentioned that the current ethos in grad schools is that the way that most people that come into grad schools think about things is they think, I'm already a great artist. I'm here to expose you to my work and to collect some contacts. That runs hand in hand with the idea of emotional support as critique. That is not a form of critique, and it does no one any favors. When we look at other things that are not critique, citation, this is another primary thing that I see in critiques that in fact are not critique. Citation critique involves bombarding the artist with a myriad of artistic references. Have you seen the Huma Baba show at Zwerner? You should look at it. Although citation may showcase the critic's breadth of knowledge, this most often serves more to assert the status of the critic than to genuinely critique the work. Citation also speculates upon a work unmanifest, a work not in the room. Now, again, I've had many colleagues in my time, both at Cranbrook as well as just out in the real world, and I've seen this over and over where in critique, the critic will simply fire a list of references at the artist. I don't believe that that's helpful in any way. No, I shouldn't say that. It is helpful, but again, it's not critique. And the value of it is arguable. It is arguable. Again, because of course, my suggestion to you is perfect in my articulation. If you just made this work like Anish Kapoor, the work would be fantastic. Yeah, well, of course. It's fucking hard as hell to make work like Anish Kapoor. The last, and again, an extremely common form of critique that we find, particularly in architecture and design school, is thesis defense. In most undergraduate art and design schools, critiques are typically structured as equal parts prescription and thesis defense. In a standard critique, a professor asks a student to discuss their work. As the student speaks, the professor listens for logical inconsistencies. When one is detected, the professor prescribes a solution. Let's examine a simplified example to identify both the thesis defense and prescription elements. So thesis defense doesn't mean that you need literally to be in a thesis defense room. This is also very undergraduate. The student says, my poster addresses Roe versus Wade, so I chose red typography to convey aggression. The professor internally thinks, that seems logical. So the professor says, if your poster supports pro-choice, why include small pictures of puppies in the background? The student says, I thought it made the poster more interesting. The professor, again, internally, puppies on a pro-choice poster are nonsensical, and the student lacks a solid rationale for this choice. So the professor says, the puppy imagery dilutes your message. And here we have prescription right here in blue. The professor says, remove the puppy images to strengthen your poster. Okay, so that, again, goes to this idea, cuts to the idea of prescriptive critique. Removing the puppy imagery is not presenting, it's not presenting the artist or designer with critical thinking and with a rich set of problems. It's providing them with a prescription to solve the problem of their work. And again, it doesn't solve the problem of the work. It simply makes a different work. All right, so here, what is defense? Let's see. Okay. The problem with thesis defense is critique. Thesis defense shifts the focus. Thesis defense shifts the focus from closely reading the artwork itself to relying on the artist's verbal justification. What an artist says about their work is not the work itself nor its meaning. Works of art are objects within a cultural matrix, and their meaning is socially constructed. The artist's intentions are merely one aspect that informs the meaning of their work. When the focus is redirected from the artwork to the artist's statement, the conversation no longer concerns the artwork, but something entirely different. Recurrent theme. This is a recurrent theme that you would hear from me. All right, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at an example from something in critique, something that was shown in critique here on, let's see, it was shown on October 19th, 2023, so this academic year. This is, I think, a really great piece by Christopher Kaufman. It's powder-coated steel casket, artificial flowers, shredded money, and metallic vinyl. Now, this work, I'm going to try and show you an extremely brief example of the ADSR method, and I'm also going to show you Bori Jiang's written critique of this work. Here we can see Arabic script on the coffin lid, and we can see set of corporate logos on the coffin lid. This is, in fact, that is a pile of shredded $1 bills. And what we see here is we see a rose that has a tag on it that's right here that says made in China. Roses around the base of the coffin. And so this is an extremely, I want to point this out. For the sake of this broadsheet, I produced a one paragraph example of the ADSR method as it pertains to Christopher Kaufman's piece, and we're going to take a look at that now. And I did it as a one paragraph, as an extremely simple one paragraph articulation as a way of making it comprehensible, hopefully. So this is an abbreviated overview of how one might approach Competition Will Destroy You Until You Visit the Graves by Christopher Kaufman. So here we are in the attack phase. Now, again, this is somewhat subjective. All critique is somewhat subjective, but there is a principle of intersubjectivity. We won't get into that right now. The attack phase. To my mind, this work has a very fast attack. The immediate phenomenon of the work is striking. The image of the coffin immediately confronts the viewer. So this work has a fast attack. As we enter this critique room, this work basically screams at you. It is impossible to deny the phenomenological aspects of the work, the size, scale, scope, and the fact that in the retina, on the mind, the first thing that we notice is that there is a massive coffin in the room. And it doesn't just simply have to do with the scale of the work, but the work has an extremely fast attack phase, the decay phase. The moment we begin to subject this work to a cognitive load, to thinking, we encounter a host of sociological issues that seem to course through the work. This socio-political and semiotic complexity conspires to make immediate sense of the work difficult. So it's my belief that, it's my belief that in the decay phase, the work falls off. It falls away intellectually from the viewer. Trying to make sense of the work, this is not a simple piece. So the second that we start to try to make sense of the work, we're confronted with a host of what would immediately be intellectually challenging and or confusing semiotics. So what do corporate logos have to do with this Arabic script? And that if we don't actually speak Arabic, how do we make sense of what that script is? So to my mind, if we look at this waveform, when we're evaluating the work falls off. Now, the sustain phase is when we stick with the work and we start to try and think through it. The work, I believe that this work rewards cognition. It rewards thinking through. As we continue to think through the semiotics of the work, the confluence of Arabic script with corporate logos, shredded dollar bills, and a verse from the Quran, the ramifications of this work open up. Arguably, the process of thinking through this work is intellectually, perceptually, and phenomenologically rewarding. So as an example, one of the things that we might do is we might use Google image search while we're in the presence of the work on our phones to take a picture of this Arabic script and to find out what it says. Now, it said that text is a verse from the Quran that says competition will destroy you until you visit the graves. Then we begin to try to piece together what shredded dollar bills made in China, what the roses have to do, and what the corporate logos have to do with this image. And I experienced this in critique, and critique is informing a big component of the actual critique is informing a large component of what I would say about the work. But what we're seeing here is I thought that it wasn't that this work was universally loved. This work was not universally loved. It wasn't as if in critique people said, man, you did a great job. That's not the conversation at all. The conversation we had was one that was filled with complex and difficult issues about the relationship between capital and the Middle East, the relationship between China, the United States, and the Middle East, as well as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so if we were to look at how this work itself engendered that conversation, the conversation itself was an incredibly rich conversation. This as an art object, what that did is it was the catalyst for that conversation. Now, arguably, the most important component of this work was in the release phase. Okay, so the release phase begins the moment that we leave. So right here, this is the release phase. The release phase begins the moment that we have left the presence of the work. And so the disturbing image of the work, the coffin festooned with corporate graphics, shredded dollar bills, and Arabic script, lingers in the imagination and memory for a considerable period after leaving the direct presence of the work. Example. So as an example, this piece engendered a conversation about this work between an Egyptian-American graduate student we have and their parents the evening of this critique after it was submitted for critique, where the Egyptian-American students shared imagery of this work with their parents, spoke to them about whether or not they thought this was legitimate, and it wasn't as if they were asking, say, is this legitimate or not? They had a conversation with them about the problematics of this work. And the point being, further, this piece circulated widely on social media, garnering considerable discussion. The presence of the work in the release phase is long. So this work exists has a very long tail outside of the presence of the work. We can think of the work of art as a kind of thesis. So thesis is a really academic way of saying something very simple, which is your idea. All works of art are, in fact, ideas embedded in material. So ideas manifest in material is the art object. So we're going to use the term art object. I consider that to be music, art, poetry, writing. So we're going to use the term art object, but basically the effective idea is that the thesis, that works of art are ideas manifest in material. Now, antithesis, which is points of crisis within the art object. So in critique, what ends up happening is the artist poses thesis, and the critique itself is posing antithesis. It's set up in opposition, antithesis. It's the opposite of the work of art. It is the counter to the work of art. What we do then is, after we receive criticism, we return to the studio and we struggle to resolve the points of crisis that were raised in the antithesis, the antithesis. If we are even remotely successful, what we end up with is the synthesis, a kind of new body of work. So this is a very short way of, so this work, again, I don't think I had it on the screen, but this work exhibits a very long tail. This is where we stop being in the presence of the work at this point when we start the release phase. And so the Egyptian American student had conversations with their parents, and here the work circulated widely on social media and got a tremendous amount of feedback on social media. And so it's important that I point out that I'm not suggesting that social media said it's great. That's not what they said. And I'm suggesting that the work lingered in the mind and imagination of the people who were in the presence of the work longer than the work itself. And therefore, that is one of the many criteria by which we can understand whether or not a work of art is good. And I would suggest that this work of art is good based upon the sustain phase. The attack phase was very strong. The sustain phase, the work rewarded, sustained cognition, and arguably more importantly, the work lingered in the mind, in the imagination. The work lingered in the mind, in the imagination of the viewers who saw the work. And so therefore, I would say that in the release phase, the sustain phase, and the attack phase, the work of art established itself as a good piece of work. Now, in this broadsheet, I also went on to show Bori Jiang, who is one of Christopher Kaufman's cohort, wrote comprehensive criticism about this work that we see here. And Bori has his own take on it, what defines the merit of an artwork and by what criteria is evaluated. I contended that the artwork resists facile categorization into binary judgments of good or bad, and I reject the notion that they are solely confined within the realm of art per se. In my view, artworks typically encompass both design and art. Art serves as the medium for the expression of emotion, while design represents the artist's conscious intention to communicate those emotions. So in the next pages, we see I cite Bori's review. So this is Bori's review of the work, and then I end the broadsheet with other examples of interpretive objects. This is by me, of course, and then some QR codes. Some QR codes with some references for research. And then the final page, which is, this is a product of the Cranbrook Academy of Art 2D department, more specifically graphic design. And so I thought what I would do is I would just do this very quickly. This broadsheet will be available from me relatively shortly if you're even remotely interested, but people have asked a lot about this critique methodology, and I thought I might share. I hope you've had a good day. See you next time. Oh, and by the way, it would help me a lot if you hit the comments. I'm genuinely interested in what you have to say. Also, if you share the video, or if you're down with the program, subscribe, right? All right, I'll see you next time.